Sobin held Wayan's hand as she was about to sit in the car. Wayan tried to get out of his grip, she said, struggling in Sobin's grip. He pulled her close to him as she turned around. Wayan shuddered. Sobin let out a sigh and stared deep into her eyes. She frowned and her gaze turned dark. She didn't utter a word and stared at him blankly. Sobin asked her again politely as his eyes softened, seeing her in such a stage where she was emotionless. She chuckled in pain and looked away. She sadly moved herself away from him and hopped in the car. Ryan drove away as she warned him. He looked down and let out a sigh. Hanol yawned while rubbing her eyes as she entered the living room. A small smile appeared on her lips after seeing Jungkook working on the laptop with a cute pout. She giggled and made her way to irritate him. She jumped on his lap and moved the laptop away. Jungkook's eyes widened in shock before he could react or move. He heard Ryan sat and ran away from them. Jungkook closed his eyes in embarrassment and stood. She nodded at him and he left. Ryan went to her closet and took her comfy clothes. She let out a sigh and started to undress her body. Her shirt fell on the floor and Jungkook entered the room. The door of the room was still broken. His eyes widened when his gaze landed on Ryan's bare body. He immediately turned around and cursed himself mentally. Ryan cut Jungkook off. Jungkook heaved a deep breath and sat on the bed. He asked in concern. She chuckled. She sat and took her phone from the bed as it rang, showing manager's name. Jungkook clenched his jaw. He was pissed off by ignorance. Ryan hung up the call and took her car keys. She was about to leave, but Jungkook held her wrist and pulled her back to him. He stared deep into her eyes, rage visible on his eyes and face. She yelled at him and jerked his hand harshly. She was panting heavily in anger. Ryan pointed at his hand while he was staring at her confused. She stepped out of the room aggressively, leaving him alone. Ryan stopped when Hanon stood in front of her with a creepy smirk on her lips. Ryan shook her head and tried to move to the other side, but Hanon stood in front of her again. Ryan asked coldly. Hanon shook her head and smiled. She chuckled and stared at Ryan's emotionless face. Ryan let out a deep sigh and shook her head before smiling. She sat and left Hanol dumbfounded. Hanol gritted her teeth and sat on the couch. Ryan bowed to Mr. and Mrs. Kim. They smiled and bowed too. Ryan's manager showed her way. She nodded and they all followed him. Ryan's eyes widened as her gaze landed on a man in a critical condition. She asked and placed a mark on her face because of a strong smell. They nodded when he stepped close to him and bent down to his level. He flinched at the presence of many people and tried to stand up. Ryan said in a concerned tone with a softened gaze. Ryan's manager told her. She let out a sigh and was about to stand up, but suddenly the man held her hand and placed a pen drive on her hand. He nodded at her. and she hid it immediately, understanding his fear. The man smiled and closed his eyes as his work was done here in the world. Now another world is waiting for him. Wayne closed his eyes with her palm and smiled. They nodded. Ambulance took his dead body away. Wayne heaved a deep breath as the ambulance disappeared in front of her gaze. She whispered and made her way to her car. Wayne was about hop in her car but stopped as her phone rang. Suddenly, a big container hit her car and drove away furiously. She glanced at her car and it was in a horrible condition. Wayne picked up the call. Her eyes frowned. The person cut off the call. Her hands were trembling badly and sweating all over her forehead. She mumbled under her breath. Junko's eye widened as he heard about Wayne's car news on the phone. He became worried about her. He said under his breath and let out a deep sigh. He glanced at Hanal's sleeping figure and shook his head. Junko's eyes lit up as his gaze landed on a familiar figure entering the house after an exhausting day. He ran to her and hugged her tightly. Junko gently patted her back to calm her down as she was panting heavily. She whispered and pushed him a little. She said in a weak voice. Junko's eyes softened. Junko requested, but she yawned his hand away from her. She yelled with all her energy and left. Vine sat on her bed and heaved a deep breath. She shook her head and threw herself on the bed. She felt her eyes getting heavy. After a few moments, she fell asleep. It had been 5 or 6 hours since Vine was sleeping peacefully. Suddenly, she felt someone's presence in her room. Vine sat up and rubbed her eyes before opening them. Her eyes frowned when she saw some makeup artist and designer with dresses. A lady sat with red hair, casting violence to widen her eyes. Vine whispered, making the lady nod her head. The designer held Vine's hand and made her stand. He dragged her into the restroom. He clapped his hand, indicating them to follow him. Designer sat with a proud face. Vine sighed and took a glance at the mirror. Her eyes widened as she saw an unexpected look. She was amazed by her look, a blue full-sleeve gown with a light makeup and messy bun with a simple bandit. She giggled at everyone's compliments. Junko glanced at him through the mirror after getting ready for the party. He was looking so handsome as always in the blue suit. His hairstyle was enough to make anyone drawn for him. Veins were popping out when he unbuttoned his sleeves and rolled them up before wearing his coat. Jungkook heaved a deep breath and let out a sigh. He shook his head and gazed at Hanol coldly. He sat and gazed at the wall clock. Jungkook shook his head and took mobile and car keys to the nightstand. He glanced at her last time before heading out of the room. She stepped down the stairs. Jungkook was waiting for her impatiently. He got up and gazed at the stairs. And his eyes widened after seeing Vian's blue gown. She was looking like an angel coming down to heaven. Jungkook's heart was pounding badly. It felt like it would come out any time. He closed his eyes and shook his head, throwing away his thought. Vian was also lost in his gaze. His look was enough to hypnotize her. She walked close to him as she reached to the living room. She smiled a little, avoided his gaze. Vine was about to pass him, but suddenly her foot twisted and she lost her balance. Jungkook was quick enough to grab her waist. He held her tightly and pulled her close to him. She was closing her eyes tightly. Jungkook lost in her face, admiring her once again this closely. He mumbled, causing her to open her eyes. Jungkook's eyes widened and he cleared his throat before leaving her. He sat and left immediately. Vine let out a sigh and followed him.